in the Department of Exercise Science, and that would be in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. And he actually is from Ottawa, I have now found out, but he did your work at the UBC, your graduate work. Yeah. And he's going to crack the mystery of my mother today. He's going to talk about video games, aging, and the politics of fitness. And my mother will only work out when I bought her a new Lululemon. So I'm really interested.
Well, I don't know if I can promise that I will crack that mystery, but I'll do my best. So I just want to say thanks, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks, of course, to everyone at the Institute for inviting me here today. So, video games, aging, and the politics of fitness promotion. This is not the most creative title I've ever come up with, I'm willing to admit. If I were to try to spice it up now, I would add a colon and the words "great expectations" before it. Still not terribly exciting, I know. In a general sense, this is a talk that centers on how new technologies are now marketed towards and consumed by older persons. And having studied media for some time now, and more recently having started research that's relevant to the aging studies field, it strikes me that aging and technological innovation are two matters that are suffused with, perhaps we can say even overwhelmed by, at times, expectations at the present time. This is a point that others have made as well. In a time of population aging, there are, of course, some dire expectations that we hear quite frequently, forecasts of a demographic time bomb, for instance. Though there's also the perception now that later life can be a time for, quote, active aging, successful aging, optimal aging, whichever term you prefer. Something that brings both opportunities and, indeed, I would say, expectations for older persons themselves. When it comes to technology, there are promises that new innovations can help cure us of our many problems, whether they be personal, social, environmental, or some other kind. This includes the promise and the accompanying expectation, I would say, that technologies can now help in the task of making us fitter and healthier, as opposed to promoting sedentary living. The reason I bring this up is that what I'll discuss today is a trend that kind of tethers together some of these nascent expectations about aging and the media. Namely, what I'll discuss is the relatively newfound sentiment that exercise-themed video games, or exergames as they're commonly called, are both appropriate for and beneficial to older persons. This is a sentiment now enunciated by industry, certainly, by news media, by seniors institutions, and implicitly, I would say, by older persons themselves. Yet, it's one that I think has received insufficient scholarly attention, at least from a sociological perspective. So, specifically what I've done is organize this talk today into two parts. In part one, I'll cover the so-called birth of exercise-themed games, or exergames, and industry's appeal through both production and marketing to consumers in the so-called third age of their lives. And here I'll do my best to try to explain why I think it is that the technology sector has paid such attention to older adults in recent years. In part two, I'll report some very early, I would say, results from the research I've been doing here at U of T on how retirement homes are actually putting games like the Nintendo Wii to use. This is the life of exergames, I've called it, meaning how they're actually used. Going back to the title of my talk, if there's a central argument or idea that I'll pursue here today, it's that both the discursive appearance of older persons in video game marketing and the physical appearance of video games in retirement homes create opportunities and expectations. These are enabling developments, in other words, but also challenging developments for both seniors themselves and for those involved in their care. This is an argument that I think is in keeping with much of the sociological literature on active aging and the so-called third age in general, and I'll say more about some of this literature as I move along. And just two small caveats before I begin. First, the images I'll use in this presentation are all under a Creative Commons photo sharing license. They're not from my own empirical research that I've been doing, and I'll provide some citations for them at the end. Second, I'll just say at the outset that I'd welcome any comments, questions, criticisms you have at the conclusion of my talk, especially given that I know there's a tremendous amount of expertise on aging studies in this room, and I describe myself as a bit of a newcomer to the field. If that sounds like an attempt to kind of butter up the audience, that's because that's exactly what it is, I suppose. Okay, so let's get to the first part of the talk. The birth of exergaming, as I've called it. And herein, as I said, I'll first describe the recent arrival of exergames at the marketplace, and then describe how older persons have been situated vis-a-vis this arrival. Now, for those who played video games for some time or who have looked back through the gaming industry's history, they will have come across many attempts at popularizing first-person active gaming. When my brothers and I were young, we played on the Nintendo Power Pad, which some of you may be familiar with, sort of this carpet-like platform that you stood on and then you could run on the spot and that would control someone who was running on screen. Lots of fun. There was also a boxing glove you could wear and then you threw a punch and your character would throw a punch, that kind of thing. But the birth of exergames, as I'm calling it, is something I would trace to 2006 and the release of the Nintendo Wii. Since this game and console would ultimately have profound effects on the video game industry specifically, and the technology sector as a whole, I would argue. So, for those unfamiliar with it, the Wii is a video game system that maps human movement carried out in the flesh onto a video screen. And it does this with the help of this nifty Wii remote controller, which you see pictured here on the left. The remote contains an accelerometer, kind of programmed to capture patterns in human movement, velocity, direction of movement, things like that, then translate that information to a sensor bar located next to the console. So by holding the remote then, the gamer's activity is replicated by a character or an avatar appearing on screen. A golf swing in the living room becomes a golf swing on the screen. Same goes for a throw in Wii bowling, a tennis stroke, or as you see in the image here, a punch in Wii boxing. These folks are using another add-on to the Wii called the Wii Nunchuck, which allows you to play with both hands. Sorry. Now, in comparison to some of its earlier attempts at first-person gaming that I mentioned before, what the Wii did was bring this style of play, whereby your physical movements are replicated on screen, to a new level of user-friendliness and sophistication. On the level of sophistication, it's the aforementioned Wii Remote, this handheld remote controller, that was really crucial to the console's development. As one Nintendo developer said in an interview posted online, the Wii style that Nintendo was aiming for could only be realized once a highly sensitive responsive sensor was implanted in the device. With that, the remote became more than a pointing device, but a tool for kind of capturing kinesthetic nuances. Meanwhile, on the level of user-friendliness, as anyone who's played the Wii has seen, many Wii games are cartoonish in their representation of the active body. Not all, but many are. So even though Wii games replicate human movement, they also at times kind of depart from the tendency in the video game industry to picture humans in more and more realistic ways. So altogether, there's kind of this kinesthetic realism, but aesthetic cartoonism, if you will, at work. And I think you can make the case that this makes Wii games more welcoming, more appealing to a mass audience. And I'll come back to the significance of this shortly. So I've said the Wii had profound effects on the gaming industry and the technology sector. And there are really two reasons I say this. First, the Wii helped spawn a new generation of video game hardware, as other companies released consoles that involve a similar embodied style of play. The two most probably prominent examples of this are consoles made by Nintendo rivals Sony and Microsoft. So on the left is an image of a young man using the Sony PlayStation Move, a console that's quite similar to the Wii. It has kind of the same remote, or a similar remote. On the right is an image of someone playing the Microsoft Kinect. And what's novel about the Kinect system is that there's no remote whatsoever. The company tagline is actually, "You are the controller," and this is possible thanks to a motion capturing camera. Altogether then, the Wii sort of pushes the gaming industry in a new direction. This is a new trend whereby gaming becomes performative, more so than before, and gamers are kind of pulled up from their seats. The second reason that the Wii's release marks an important moment is that more than signaling a new trend towards motion capture, it ushered in a new imperative in the video game industry as well. This is where we arrive at the birth of exercise gaming, or exergaming, and the will towards promoting health and fitness through new media. Now, we've heard for years how screen time in general, and time playing video games in particular, is bad for us. Just 10 years ago, for instance, the Public Health Agency of Canada noted that increased reliance on video games, among other technologies and other factors, is cited by experts as one of the key reasons for the growing number of sedentary children and teenagers. This is a common worry and indeed a common topic in the academic literature. But in the years since the Wii reached the market, we've seen a veritable deluge of exercise-themed technologies that seem aimed at reversing this long-standing assumption. Wii Sports, Zumba Fitness, Fit and Six, My Fitness Coach, My Weight Loss Coach, UFC Personal Trainer, Jillian Michaels Fitness Ultimatum, which the ultimatum always seems a little bit strong to me, but at any rate, the list goes on and on and on. And as you can see from the last 3 titles listed here, exergames focus on either the body or the brain, or sometimes both. And again, this is a point I'll come back to in a few moments. And so the point here is that there's now exercise software to go along with the hardware I mentioned before. Maybe the most prominent exergame yet, and the one that best demonstrates this newfound fitness imperative, is Wii Fit. This is a game that's compatible with the Wii, and that has yet another hardware addendum, this kind of flat weight scale size balance board that you see here. This is essentially a controller for the feet. That's how Nintendo describes it. And once you're standing on the Wii Fit balance board, you can partake in a vast range of activities. Everything from strength training to yoga to balance exercises to virtual sports. You can also take regular measures of the body, like weight, center of balance, or as you see at the bottom here, BMI, which is a weight to height statistic, and a popular, though somewhat controversial, indicator of overweight and obesity. And here we see the cartoonish aesthetic of the Wii at work once again. Lastly, one of the most noteworthy features of the Wii is its interactive virtual trainers. Trainers who, as it says here, keep an eye on you. So if you get off the Wii board in the middle of an exercise and slack off, the trainers will notice and tell you off, which again seems a little harsh, or ask you to come back. So Wii Fit then might have some fun, kind of cartoonish components, but it's also portrayed as a serious exercise tool. Very serious, apparently. Now, what makes all of this relevant to this talk here today is the way that older persons have been positioned, and indeed have positioned themselves, in relation to these relatively new developments. On their way towards casting aside the common perception that video games engender passivity or sedentariness, the gaming industry has also sought to kind of uproot the traditional view that their products are made exclusively for male youth. In fact, I would say that these 2 points go hand in hand. That the health imperative of new video games is an entreaty to all kinds of new consumers. This is a point that's hinted at in the work of Deborah Chambers, who studied Nintendo Wii commercials. Nintendo commercials, she says, share key features that signify the console's rightful place in the communal space of the living room. The activity, whether sport or quiz game, is staged in the heart of spacious, uncluttered middle-class suburban homes. The game is performed by all members of a nuclear-style family, by parents, children, and even visiting grandparents. We see this with Wii Fit as well. On the right is an image of the Wii Fit box. So along with adult women and male and female youth, there's kind of a courtship of older consumers here with the image of the man second from the right. I know that the quality of that picture isn't great. Perhaps an even better example of this kind of courting of seniors came with the release of Wii Fit Plus, an update to the original Wii Fit game in 2009. Wii Fit Plus came with a marketing campaign, which some of you may have seen, that saw Helen Mirren, the now 67-year-old actress, partaking in activities ranging from yoga to hula hooping to jogging, all with the Wii Fit's assistance. I have to say, the brilliant thing about the Wii Fit Plus, says Mirren in one video posted on YouTube, is the variety of it. Because I find exercise is a bit like meeting an old lover. You know, you're really pleased to see him, and you get tired of him really quickly. And you remember why you didn't like him in the first place. You know? So exercise is a bit like that to me. So with the Wii, it's like having a new lover every day. And she laughs, what could be better for a girl? Now, as I said earlier, the new health imperative in the gaming sector has wrought games for the brain as well as the body. And these games for brain training, as they've been called, are a vehicle through which industry has solicited the attention of seniors as well. So brain training is the notion that with regular participation in cognitive activities like math puzzles or linguistic quizzes, one can keep the brain, quote, young and sharp. This is sometimes called neurobics as well, and it follows from recent findings in the neurosciences, on brain plasticity. The idea that with proper stimulation, the brain can forge new neural connections over time as opposed to simply decaying. The game Brain Age and its sequel, Brain Age 2, have been two of Nintendo's most successful products in recent years. As it says at the company's online marketing site, these games are inspired by the work of prominent Japanese neuroscientist Dr. Ryuta Kawashima and feature activities designed to help stimulate your brain and give it the workout it needs, like solving simple math problems, counting currency, drawing pictures on the Nintendo DS touchscreen, that's kind of a handheld console that you can use, and unscrambling letters. You can see here with this mention of workouts how Nintendo actually draws from the language we typically use to describe the active body to now describe the active brain. This is not atypical. In fact, brain game makers often say the brain is just like a muscle, and so you can, quote, use it or lose it. This is a point I'll come back to in a moment. Now, according to industry, there are implications to this for everyone. Nintendo has promoted Brain Age 2 by saying, baby boomers and test prepping school kids alike will want to challenge themselves and find ways to stay sharp. Along with this, at brain game marketing sites, we see images of consumers from across the lifespan, including adults and older adults, indeed trying to navigate their way through various cognitive challenges. Happy Neuron, another company that makes brain training software, includes a testimonial page on their marketing site that features positive reviews for its products from consumers between the ages of 52 and 78. But there's also a specific appeal to seniors, I would say, through language that implicitly and sometimes explicitly depicts later life as a time where cognitive decline is particularly disconcerting. Here's a passage from Happy Neuron's promotional website. They say, it's now commonly accepted that brain training, as part of a healthy lifestyle, can help keep you sharp and help defer brain decline, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. Happy Neuron's brain training program offers essential capabilities not found in other brain fitness programs. Now, there's a growing body of literature on aging and neurocultures. Simon Williams, Paul Higgs, and Stephen Katz, for example, write of the promise now made by the neurosciences of treating, managing, protecting, even boosting or improving cognitive powers of the brain, and thereby improving, if not optimizing, the human condition in various ways. This, I think, is what we're seeing here with brain training games, only with consumer culture standing as kind of a middle person between these promises from scientific experts on the one hand and the experiences of aging actively or optimally on the other. So that's the work of industry on the one hand, and of marketing tech specifically. But what further cements this notion that exergames can have benefits for seniors is the work of new media. This was especially true in the first few years following the release of the Wii and Wii Fit, as well as prominent brain games like Brain Age 2. At that time, we saw headlines like young or old, everyone wants a Wii, seniors trade walkers for Wii, seniors get active and hooked on Wii, Wii gets seniors back in the game, and brain fitness craze blooms as boomers age. They hope games, puzzles will help keep minds healthy. Of course, what these headlines also imply is that there are many seniors purchasing and enjoying exergames as well, that seniors are kind of active agents here, and are not just blindly following the directives of consumer culture. So the question is, I think, and I hope you'll be interested in, how can we explain this trend? What I've said thus far about the so-called birth of exergames is descriptive, and what I'd like to do now is make 2 points that go towards explaining and not just outlining what's afoot here. The first is that the inclusion of fitness messages and procedures in video games, and in turn the marketing of these games towards seniors, can be explained through a fairly basic assessment of the political economy of new media. The technology sector is exceedingly competitive. There's that old phrase, creative destruction, whereby capitalism kind of incessantly abolishes the old in favor of the new. And I think really there's nowhere where this is more true these days than in new media. And the reason the level of competition is so high, or one of the reasons at least, is that life cycles in the tech sector are comparatively short, and indeed seem to be growing shorter and shorter as time passes. For video game makers, there's the pressure to constantly add new tweaks to their consoles then, or updated features to their games. Nintendo has to quickly move from Wii Fit to Wii Fit Plus, for example, or from Brain Age to Brain Age 2. Steve Klein and his colleagues in the book Digital Play point out that in the video game industry, things really intensified this way first in the 1980s, when the company Atari and then Nintendo kind of revitalized the household gaming market. By the late 1990s, console gaming was defined as a perpetual innovation business, they say, as companies like Sega had joined the fray. In fact, Sega momentarily overtook Nintendo, they say, by introducing the 16-bit console. Hardly had this established itself on the market, though, before the eyes of the industry turned to the next logical technological revolution, a still more advanced 32-bit game-playing machine, the so-called next-generation console. With the time lag between new product cycles diminishing, developing a new console, determining the timing of its launch, building attractive game libraries, and creating the requisite marketing buzz were to prove frantically exhausting missions. And so what Klein and his colleagues are highlighting here is that in the face of this blazing competitiveness, as they call it, there's a dire need to reinvest profits in the name of innovation, in the name of securing tomorrow's profits. This, of course, is fundamental to capitalism in general. It's a point that David Harvey goes on at length about in his recent book, The Enigma of Capital. If I, as a capitalist, he says, do not reinvest in expansion and a rival does, then after a while I'm likely to be driven out of business. I need to protect and expand my market share. I have to reinvest to stay a capitalist. Harvey lists other motives for reinvestment and accumulation, but the point of reinvesting to expand market share and in turn kind of fend off or push out rivals is, as I said, kind of a basic business principle. As Klein and his co-writers point out, when it comes to the video game industry, reinvestment has typically involved building sleeker, more sophisticated consoles, presumably in the hopes that this will retain existing gamers or attract new ones, I guess you could say. Nintendo, for example, has moved from the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-1980s, upon which much of my childhood was lost or spent, I guess, depending on your perspective, to the Super Nintendo in the early 1990s, to the Nintendo 64 later on, and then finally the Wii in the mid-2000s. But what we see now is not just a refining of gaming consoles, but a reimagining of what they can do and for whom they're appropriate. This means investment on the one hand in health promotion, and more specifically in the incorporation of expert health knowledge into video games. We saw, for example, how brain training games are based on kind of expertise from the neurosciences, as well as investments in the development of hardware and software that allows for body and brain measurements and physical or cognitive training activities. On the other hand, it involves investment in marketing new commodities towards new demographics: seniors, women, families, and fitness enthusiasts, to name a few. To make this point another way, here are two quotations from prominent Nintendo spokespeople. The first, on the left, speaks to the investment in health promotion with the Wii. We thought that the Wii would be a device that would be placed in the living room, and the one subject we felt we had to have in order to achieve this was health. The second, on the right, speaks to the appeal to new demographics. We want to appeal to mothers who don't want consoles in their living rooms, and to the elderly and to young women. It's the challenge like trying to sell cosmetics to men. The takeaway point then is that Nintendo's appeal to seniors, among others, is no fluke, I think, no random coincidence, but in the first instance is a function of a desire to expand the gaming market in the name of profit. This explanation, though, I would say, kind of around the political economy of media, is unsatisfactory in itself. If the video game industry's recent entreaty to seniors were strictly a matter of economics, it might well have taken place years ago. This, I would say, is a cultural phenomenon, too, which is to say it has something to do with the relatively newfound meanings we attach to retirement and later life. And so this is where some of the literature that's written at the intersection of cultural studies and aging studies becomes relevant. In particular, the concept of the third age. The third age is a notion that I'm sure is familiar to many in this room. I don't think it's perfect, but is helpful in this context. On one level, this is a descriptive concept pertaining to the group of people who have moved beyond the work stage of their lives, that is, their so-called second age, but have not yet reached a fourth age characterized by kind of less independence. On another level, though, the third age is about imagining later life in a new way. Whereas once retirement was viewed as a time for social retrenchment, physical inactivity, and cognitive decline, these axioms are increasingly being questioned or even turned upside down. Indeed, later life, as Paul Higgs and his colleagues argue, is now different in character than it was for past generations, and for a variety of reasons. And I'll apologize ahead of time for oversimplifying some important trends here, kind of for the sake of establishing our current social and economic conjuncture. There is, first of all, the population aging phenomenon in many countries, of course, as the baby boomers grow older, which creates sort of a critical mass of older persons. With that is the fact that many seniors are, in general, living longer, healthier lives than those who came before them. I recognize that this is a trend that's inflected by differences in class and other factors. But as a general point, I think it's fair to say that modern medicine presents the opportunity, at the very least, for some to live longer. Third agers form a politicized demographic. This is a cohort that was involved in the social movements of the past and that remain skilled at mobilizing politically and calling attention to their interests. Fourth, and probably most pertinent to this talk, third agers have grown older in an era characterized by consumerism. And so they're not just viewed as any old market demographic, as I described before, pardon the pun, but a demographic with an understanding of consumer culture and oftentimes a demographic with purchasing power as well. This confluence of factors has led to the point where, in the United States, for example, the proportion of household expenditure by people aged 65 to 74 on what's been called complex consumption, meaning entertainment, leisure, personal care products and services, rose from 2/3 to 90% of the national average from 1985 to 2005. This figure comes from the work of Gilliard and Higgs. They furthermore go on to say the following: increasing numbers of older people can and do engage in consumer lifestyles that ignore, avoid, or deny the identification of self with a social and cultural identity conferred by a chronologically defined agedness. The consumption and identity work that was located in the teenage and early adult years during the, quote, cultural revolution of the 1960s has since spread upward and outward across the life cycle. Propelling this lifestyle agenda is a plethora of lifestyle manuals directing the mature consumer towards a variety of seemingly ageless lifestyles. You can see here that there's an interaction between agency and structure at work. There's an interest on the one hand among seniors in partaking in consumer culture, and on the other there's a lifestyle agenda on the part of industry, feeding, or if you're more of a cynic, creating this demand. And importantly, if we go back to the marketing messages I referenced earlier, it seems that these are not just about promoting exergaming, but indeed are about promoting exergaming as part of a seemingly ageless lifestyle. For Helen Mirren, evidently, the we is like having a new lover every day. Of course, she's saying this in jest, but I would say this helps create a picture of later life in which remaining socially and physically engaged is central to one's identity work, as Gilliard and Higgs say. The point in bringing this up is that the video game industry's attempt to capture new demographics has not taken place in a vacuum. It has come in conjunction with, and I think you can make a strong case that it's partly a function of, the arrival of a renewed understanding of what it means to be old. I'd like to make one final point on this matter before moving on to some of the empirical work I've been doing on seniors' uses of the we. What the literature on aging that I've been working with here suggests is that third age discourses are sort of a double-edged sword. They're both enabling and constraining. The first enabling in that by imagining exercise in a new way, exercise among other things, they present new possibilities for seniors. For example, when it comes to exercise, the, quote, ghettoization of seniors, as it's been called, of times past, involved the idea that aging and physical decline were necessarily intertwined, as I said before. As Emmanuel Tull and Nikki Dorr point out, however, there's now an entire industry built around active aging, an industry that encourages seniors to embed physical activity into their everyday lives. Evidently, video games are now being designed for this purpose too, and in this sense, they offer new opportunities. The other side of this, though, are pressures, or to return to my title, expectations that accompany third age discourses. There's a fine line, I would argue, between depicting later life as a time where you can stay active, engaged, even youthful, and depicting this as the way to, quote, age successfully. If we go back to brain training games, I've argued previously that while they provide new opportunities, they also at times mobilize what you might call panic discourses around aging in the brain, based on the dyad of successful and unsuccessful aging. For example, marketing for brain games at times features this phrasing, use it or lose it, as I said before. This is something that's picked up by news media quite frequently too. And while there may indeed be benefits to exercising the brain, what I'm saying is that when presented by industry, the use it or lose it aphorism calls forth the rather unsettling idea that if you don't partake in consumer culture, you're going to lose your mind. The point that I'm making then about health-themed video games for seniors is not unlike what other scholars have said about cosmetic products, pharmaceuticals, or other parts of consumer culture. That in a time when older persons are increasingly encouraged to take responsibility with the help of the marketplace for all aspects of their lives, there is an easy slippage between promoting individual opportunities for pursuing active aging and promoting kind of panic discourses about later life. Okay, so as I've said at the outset, what I'd like to do in the second part of this presentation, which is much shorter than the first part, by the way, I won't go on too much longer, is offer some initial insights from the research I've been doing on seniors' uses of exergames like the Wii in Ontario retirement centers. As the news headlines I highlighted before suggest, since its release, the Wii has become a popular tool in retirement facilities in Canada, as well as in the US and other places. So in this postdoc research that I'm now pursuing, what I set out to do was explore the experiences of seniors using these technologies and of retirement center staff creating or providing exergaming programming. As it says here, this has involved both interviews and participant observation. Though, again, I want to stress that this work is still quite young. I've spoken with a half dozen activities coordinators or activities staff thus far and have been on site to observe Wii games in progress for a couple of months. I'm going to speak only to these two components of the study, as I've only actually just this week begun interviewing residents at retirement homes. Now, there's a caveat here in that the older persons involved in this research are not necessarily those that Nintendo and other companies are appealing to in their marketing. Here we are talking about communitarian uses of the Wii, if you can call it that, as opposed to personalized uses or uses in the confines of the household. We're also talking about a seniors population that is slightly older, maybe slightly less independent than the quote ideal seniors that are represented in game advertising. These are individuals in their late 70s and beyond, most of whom are in assisted living arrangements. This research then is just kind of a small slice of the work that I think needs to be done on seniors' uses of new media, but at the same time I do think it lends some useful insights into the benefits and challenges of people's exergame experiences. This is an image you have here that was titled Grandpa Plays Wii Bowling, that's what it was called. Again, not from my research. So what the staff members I've spoken with thus far have agreed upon is that in the first instance, the Wii can be, and usually is, a very positive addition to their activities programming. Games like Wii Bowling and Wii Golf seem to be more popular than full-scale exercise games like Wii Fit, though one of the sites I visited did have a Wii Fit balance board on hand. This fondness for the Wii is hardly surprising. You would expect individuals who organize Wii activities on a regular basis to find benefits in such initiatives, otherwise why would they keep them on their activities agenda? Nevertheless, the perception that video games have variegated merits is worth highlighting. This is the viewpoint, for example, of Kim, one of the activities coordinators I spoke with. When I asked her about residents' motivations for using the Wii, she named the social aspect first. There are some people, she says, who will be motivated because they want to be there with their friends and get together. In my own observation of Wii activities, I found that while there is sometimes a sense of competitiveness at work in Wii activities, seniors might say divide into two teams and keep score in Wii Bowling, for example, the idea of having a rewarding and entertaining social experience seems to trump this. In fact, sometimes the competitiveness of a game like Wii Bowling is actively undermined in the sense that seniors will root for the opposing team as well as their own, or will simply pass the controller around at random with no regard for scorekeeping. This complements findings from other research on older persons' activity experiences. I think Denise Copelton, for instance, found that older persons were reluctant to use pedometers to keep track of their distance traveled in exercise programs for fear that this might pit participants against one another. Kim goes on to mention that there's a kind of technological curiosity motivating seniors too. They want to come see what the game is like. And also that this is a physical activity that harkens back to some of the pastimes that the residents were once involved in. This is bowling, and bowling was once popular. Barb, another activities coordinator, makes many of these same points. There's a social component, a physical activity component, and lastly, a desire to keep up with the latest technology. As it says at the bottom here, I think they want to know. They want to be able to play with their grandkids and do things like that. They want to stay current. Indeed, in our interview, Barb noted that in general, many of the residents where she works are into new technologies. This is partly a function, I think, of the demographic these homes are catering to. They have cell phones, they have computers, they email me on a daily basis, whether they send me jokes or ask me for help with something. This takes us back to a point I made earlier, that while there are rightfully concerns right now about a nascent digital divide between younger and older generations, these are seniors who spent their adulthood in consumer culture and in a time of post-war technological innovation. And so while offering Wii games seems to come in part from a desire to diversify activity programming, it also comes from the presumption that many seniors are technologically adept, or at least technologically curious. That there is some empirical basis for the images of active aging that are now so prominent in media. Jim, a coordinator at another site, likewise noted that it's not just the Wii that has infiltrated retirement settings, but Wi-Fi, iPods, iPads, Netflix, and so on. We're always just looking for new technology, he says, new ideas, better ways of doing things. But while the Wii's incursion into retirement communities is viewed positively, there are challenges that have arisen too. First, the interviews with activities coordinators, as well as my participant observation, gave a sense of some of the newfound pressures that come with exergaming. The benefits I outlined previously are contingent on the successful manipulation of the Wii controller. So for people who have no experience with this type of technology, as Jim said later in our interview, or this era of technology, it can be frustrating. And to me, Jim's choice of words here is highly significant. Even if you pass through adulthood in consumer culture, we're dealing here with technologies that are unlike any that have come before them. This is a new era of first-person gaming. This means, Jim says, you have to be standing in the right spot. You have to be pointing the right way. You've got to press A and swing the Wii remote at the same time. It's challenging. To put this in other terms, what's needed here is a combination of media literacy, seeing the screen and interpreting what's taking place, and proficiency with media hardware. And frustrations arise when one of these is waning, or when they don't work together. The outcome, says Jim, is that staff members need to kind of step in and model a Wii bowling throw first. Younger staff especially show them what to do and introduce the components of the game part by part. This is something I've witnessed many times over during my participant observation sessions. But while this can be a successful strategy, and by this I mean the tactic of having staff model technology usage, I think it's fair to say that it also downloads some of the pressures that accompany new media onto activities coordinators and caregivers themselves. There are a few of our care people who've never used the Wii, says Kim, or like Netflix. That was a challenge getting that going. I'd get calls at home. How do you turn this on? What do you do? And things like that. So there's challenges there because even with our staff, they're not as comfortable with the technology. Another activities coordinator made a near identical point. It's hard enough to train staff to give care well and approach people well and do all of these things that are necessary to have person-centered care. But then to teach people to use technology, well, that's an additional use of resources. It's worth stating that this was undoubtedly viewed as an important use of resources. As I was starting my research at this particular site, the activities coordinator quoted here was organizing a training session on the Wii for a number of staff members so they could sort of develop their own proficiency with this device. But the point is that the pressures and expectations brought on by new technologies are hard to escape. They impact both those participating in and those offering video game-based activities. And I'll just make one final point on this, returning once again to a quotation from Jim. Here he describes how these challenges related to the Wii specifically are a synecdoche of a larger issue. That is to say, retirement centers in general, in his view, face a condition whereby they are required to be ever more technologically proficient. I can see that people are going to be more aware of what's out there, he says. They're going to want responses faster. They're going to want things done quickly because they can, easily go online and see that somebody has, say, a Zumba class in a home that's down the road. Why don't we have that? So to be connected the way that we are now in this generation and to have that experience coming into seniors' homes is, I think, going to raise the expectations. With this, we return back to the great expectations that are consequent upon the onset of the information age and the population aging at the same time. The development, marketing, and use of new technologies for and by older persons is, to be sure, a significant and in some ways encouraging trend. I'll say in closing, the celebration we've seen of this trend by industry or news media should not draw our attention away, I think, from the discursive and material pressures that it engenders as well. With that, I'll just click through the references for the talk today, which are many, apparently, and say thanks very much for listening.
Anybody wants to ask some questions? Feel free, right? Yeah.
Sure. Can I say no? Is that all?
Yeah. Somebody will say no.
I'm just walking.
Thank you. Your population that you're studying is relatively independent, coming from an assisted living population and just starting to lose some of their independence. Is there any plan to take a look at how this would apply to a more dependent population, maybe nursing homes, long-term care facilities? Because you would think that would impact it a little bit more, and starting to get some cognitive decline,
Yep.
things like that.
Yeah, some of them use exergames in both settings, like some of the homes would use them for both assisted living residents and in kind of their long-term care section. Maybe slightly more for the assisted living. I think that that does impact the perceived benefits of using the technology. That with the long-term care residents, there's a perception that the physical and the cognitive activity is much more significant and much more important as well. So maybe it's less of a social activity for those individuals and more of a physical activity, whereas for the residents in assisted living who are more independent, it would be viewed more as kind of a social experience and a bit of physical activity, but nothing too onerous in terms of physical activity.
Does Baycrest use it?
Yes, and I was just telling Brad that in the intergenerational school, where we have a study to look at Microsoft Connect,
Right.
which I do think is a breakthrough and a breakthrough, because the notion that you can do without controllers and have a sensor that can detect facial expressions, and that can be mimicked on your avatar is really kind of amazing. So let me ask you a question. One is, in the politics of this, how much is science playing a role, and medicine for that matter? Because in the brain fitness domain without exercise, there are even companies like Posit Science, who have the name of science in their title, because they're all competing to accumulate the most evidence that they can cure Alzheimer's. I'm exaggerating. But Posit Science actually has an application into the FDA. So this whole notion of where these devices fit in the medical science world is the question I have for you. And you mentioned references, but you didn't actually say that there's a big literature out there, demonstrating the value in randomized control studies, for example. So,
Yes.
So kind of, where is it in relationship to science and medicine?
So, yeah, the short answer is I don't know the complete answer to that question, in part because that is just not where I focus my attention, and it's not where my expertise lies. You're absolutely right. There is a large body of literature on this. You know, from some of the literature that I've looked at, it seems that there's a suggestion that participation in these types of brain training games is useful for those types of tasks, but they're not yet sure that it's kind of generalizable to your kind of everyday life. Again, I say that not having a great grasp of the literature because that's not what I've focused on in my work and that's not my expertise. What I'm more interested in is the way that scientific expertise is mobilized in the project of selling these technologies to individuals. That it's one thing to say brain training is useful for all of these reasons, and it's another thing, and I think more convincing, to say brain training is useful for these reasons, and here's a whole load of scientific experts who have said so. And that can be a good thing, for sure. To incorporate science into video game activity can have some benefits. I think what comes with it, though, is potentially some confusion about what the kind of good and maybe bad science is behind this, right? So for consumers, this goes into some of the pressures and expectations that I'm referring to. There's this new opportunity to participate in brain training as I grow older, and yet I have to wade through these materials in order to sort out what really is valid and what maybe is not so valid. Just on the Kinect, I was going to say too, that the Kinect is fascinating, right? Because you don't have the controller. You are the controller, as they say quite frequently. Microsoft does. And I think that's interesting. You know, in doing this research, the combination of kind of media literacy and proficiency with media hardware that I referred here is a challenge. You do have to see what's going on the screen. You have to hold down the trigger button on the back, and then you have to execute a bowling throw and release the trigger at about the right time. And the number of times that I've seen, well, I should say there's been many times where I've seen people try to execute these steps, and they hold down the trigger and then let go before they throw the ball, or they hold on to the trigger for too long. What happens when you do that is a menu screen comes up and says, kind of, whoops, you did this wrong, press this button and you can go back to the start. So you have to have the combination, right? You have to have the kind of ability to use the hardware and then see the screen and say, okay, I did something wrong, I need to execute this step and go back to the start. And it can be quite frustrating, both for the people involved and for the care staff. Certainly people get better as they get more practice at it. So the Kinect kind of eliminates one of those elements, right? It does take out the controller and you can just kind of mimic the throw. I suspect that there are all kinds of new difficulties and challenges that emerge, but it does take out one of the steps along the way. And I know some of the folks that I've spoken with have said we're interested in getting the Kinect for that very reason. I don't know if that fits with what you've found in your own research.
We've only started, and we're doing a study where we have young folks and older folks exercise together, because with the Kinect you can have two people standing next to each other. And we're comparing young and old folks working together, and we're comparing brain fitness with brain fitness and the exercise component, because you can use the Microsoft product without the Kinect controller. But you know, the exciting thing that I think we're moving to is connecting people who are not in the same physical space. Because if we can get the elders in the long-term care facility to exercise with the kids in the school, and they're not needing to be bussed one place or the other, but they're standing in front of different television screens, then you can imagine this vast universe of people that are exercising actually in a common space that could be much more collective than just two people.
Interesting.
Because actually, I don't think we need a whole lot more evidence around the exercise piece, because if you get the body moving, whether you get the mind moving, because I think this muscle to mind metaphor is kind of silly, but I'm willing to believe if you get somebody off the couch and you get them moving, I don't need enough evidence. I don't need any more evidence that that's going to be beneficial. You know, there's this new expression in preventive medicine: sitting is the new smoking. So just getting people to stop sitting, which you do, because it's remarkably. We show a picture to a big, a whole auditorium full of people, and there's one person whose body is mimicking is moving the avatar, but the whole audience thinks that they're interacting with the avatar. It's an amazingly addictive experience if you haven't had it.
Just maybe one other thing I would say, just going back to the point about sort of executing the appropriate series of steps is, you know, I'm struck in doing this research, and I suppose that I could have or should have predicted this at the outset, but how important the language is in moderating these activities with the residents who are participating in them. So I think if you say, say you try to execute the Wii bowling throw, you're unsuccessful, and you're trying to explain how to do it in the correct way, if you say hold down the B button, which is the button on the back of the controller, and throw it, that's not necessarily meaningful. It might be if you have some familiarity with it, but the B button could be any old button. Sort of like saying hold it right side up. If you've never seen an object before, right side up and upside down are not necessarily clear. Whereas if you say hold down the trigger, it's different because then you actually have sort of a metaphor in your mind of what to do, right? So the language becomes really significant, I think, in helping the residents develop the skills needed to participate in these activities.
Colored on our controllers.
Right.
They're not working. Instead of having B and A buttons, we colored them like red and green because that visual stimuli meant something to fellow adults rather than just a letter.
As long as they're not colorblind.
Yes. Yeah.
Somebody said at one point in the research, I think it was one of the staff members who said they put the buttons in all the wrong places on these controllers. And that was because you have to hold the trigger at the back, but there's buttons on the front. If you press the buttons on the front, then that brings up the menu screen as well. So if you accidentally push a button on the front, then it pauses the activity too. So the colors work as well, but then there's also actually kind of manipulating the device too, which presents a challenge.
But Brad, you know what I think? There's an enormous market out there. It's enormous. And it just strikes me that these companies, like you say, they're involving some more health promotion people. But I mean, the opportunities for older adults and intergenerational relationships in doing this, you wonder why they would design it that way. Do you know what I mean? Like, where's their head?
Right.
I mean, that's where the money's going to be. And I mean, all these people that are interested in physical exercise and the rest of them are the people that they should be talking to.
Right.
And older people themselves to put it together. I mean, I'm always surprised by that. I mean, this looks like a huge opportunity to me for, it's amazing. It's like caregiving groups online now. Everybody can get together in groups and work together. I love the intergenerational thing. It's excellent, right?
Yeah.
Like, why aren't they doing this? Why?
Because the companies are full of 20 and 30-year-olds.
Year-olds who don't get it, yeah. Somebody needs to tell them. The message, I'm sorry.
Well, it's a very interesting talk. I'm just curious, even though you said using the Microsoft Connect,
answering your question all that well, but I suppose it's the best.
I work in a community center at San Christopher House, and we use the we for our participants. They are around 70, 75, 80, and we've been using the we for 4 years. We have once a week, they play we in the afternoons, and once a year we have a tournament. And, you know, they are pretty consistent. They come to all sessions, they train during July, they come to the tournament, and I think I agree with you. It's, you know, if we don't do those activities, they would be sitting down and, you know, crocheting and talking bad about other people. But, you know, when we had, usually it's what I do. But when we create activities, they just come and, you know, interact. And we have, during the summer, we have intergenerational activities. We have kids who come for the leadership program. They volunteer with the we. So, and the more we give those opportunities, the more they will engage. And I think to us, and we use also computers, we have computer clubs and all those things. We are doing now dancing, using YouTube and all that. I think gives to them the idea that technology is something that's gonna bite them. You know, they go to the banks, they have to deal with banking machines, they have to deal with so many things that, you know, microwaves and things that they weren't used to before. And my population is 75, 80, and 90. So sometimes it is challenging to help them with the controller. Frustrates the other participants who wants to play and they want to do this quick because they know how to do that. Sometimes you have to go there and help them, you know, move your finger, and, you know, and you have to do 3, 4, 5 times, and eventually they will get it. But I think what I like about the we and all the technology that we can make available to them is that they are part of something that we don't have control anymore. You know, wherever you go, you have technologies and you have to face it. And I see as our responsibility to make them a little bit more comfortable when they have to face those different things.
But I think the trend is also towards embedded technology, so that the computer gets smarter and the users can be dumber, shall we say, not to insult anybody. But I actually think that this is a transmedia opportunity because, for example, as I was saying to you, we've got our bicycles on the back, and after we're finished listening to you, we're going to be so inspired to go out and ride our bicycles on Niagara and the lake. But the bicycle community is nuts about monitoring heart rate and cadence, and if you've got that connected to the Wii Fit, or so you can be competitive. But then if you've got the technology from your coach on the platform here, could actually know exactly what you did when you took your bicycle ride at Niagara on the lake. And the coach actually could speak to you through microphones, so you're listening while you're riding. I mean, the whole notion that your whole pattern of motion in physical space, and the motion of an entire community in physical space, because ultimately the answer to fitness is not just these games, it's actually transforming cities like Toronto by Mayor Ford's reception, perhaps creating more bicycle paths, and Bixie and all those kinds of things. So this has to be part of a much more comprehensive campaign in which the information technology seamlessly, you know, keeps you abreast of what you're doing and how the whole neighborhood is doing, that kind of stuff. I mean, to me, it's enormous. I'm just agreeing with you, Len, that written large, this is huge.
And it's huger than activity theory in aging, which I'm hearing a lot right now. This is an activity, let's keep them, you know, Stephen Katz's busybodies. I don't think that's great, busybodies. But I'm looking at Maureen, who's in NU. Why aren't the people in kinesiology and and phys ed, why aren't they, besides you, you're the only person I've ever met, one of them, and Maureen, why aren't these people more involved in using this in the exercise programs that we develop for older people? Like University of Western is a huge program. I don't think they use this. Do they?
In London?
Yeah.
I've never heard.
Like, I mean, I'm talking about the people, who, the trainers, all these, you know, not just activity people that provide leisure activities and socialization, but real exercise, where you have somebody coming in on your ear while you're riding your bike or whatever.
Well, you get into some interesting territory when you start talking about prescriptive use of physical activity, and you risk alienating people by applying those kinds of and embedding those as normative expectations for how the body's going to be moving and how we must all use our bodies. I see the value in these kinds of tools, the tools like the Wii and the Microsoft technology, as being largely methods of people embedding physical movement with social behaviors. I wouldn't call it exercise. And it's not going to get to those target rates and those markers you're supposed to meet, because that's what's been decided, or that's what's been determined is optimal for our age or our whatever. These are social tools, and that's one of the great success stories in this. And this is, Brad, what you're describing here is how you've got people coming out of the rooms into common space to move and to share the activity and share the moment, which is also one of the reasons why those moments where you have to teach someone, they might frustrate the odd individual, but largely it's embedded in that social context. So if somebody needs a bit of help using the console, then it's not a big problem. It's not going to break my stride. I'm not going to be, off my cardio max here. So get on, Mabel. Take grips with that console there, because you're taking me down a peg. I don't really see that as being part of the way this technology is used.
No, but why couldn't it be used that way? I guess is what I'm saying.
I suppose it could.
And better developed.
But do you really
to answer
want that? Do you
well, I
really
don't know.
want to go in the direction of chasing people around to be fit?
No, but
Or
you
do you want-
don't have to call it exercise. You don't have to do any of that. But it could be. And it could be well calibrated by the questions you say by a phys ed person who knows the answers.
But I agree with you that the social piece is key.
Yeah.
But I just heard Eric Topol talk about the destruction of medicine around biomonitoring.
Yeah.
So there's no reason that you couldn't have your EKG as you're riding your bicycle, communicate straight to your primary care doctor's office, and if while you were exercising you had some, I think it's different strokes for different folks. But I'm a big believer in the social part rather than the biomonitoring, but that's available.
But
you
that
can
would
do
also
both.
that would also be an impediment to a lot of people.
Yeah.
There are people who don't want to have their blood pressure taken, and
Right.
who avoid physicians because they don't want that particular monitor.
And I'm not saying that
Yeah.
at all. I'm saying, firstly, if I got on the Wi-Fi, I'd fall flat in my face. Yeah, right, really, I try. And you know what? If it's really good for me as an exercise, then it would really be good to have someone like you there to say, no, this is how you do, la, 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 like you're doing, just like you're doing. Only, at this speed, this rate, this is good for you.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell me, oh, your cardiac is blah-de-blah, I don't care. You're
Well,
right, I don't care. I'm there for the fun, to be with the people,
That's it.
and to get some exercise.
So the fundamental question then becomes: is this play or is this serious
Who
work?
cares?
Well, yeah,
We blend
that's what I'm
it.
saying. If we're keeping it as play and getting people moving at the same time, I think the thing has done its job.
Well, I think we can be smarter about how we get people to move. That's all I'm saying. In a social context.
As someone who's about the top end of the people we've been talking about, there are two things that interest me. One is the rapidity of change of technology is counterproductive with older people. I mean, it's harder to learn. I have a hard time keeping up with downloads on my computer. They're always upgrading, and I have to learn that I can't do the thing in a familiar way, and I have to find out how it works. I think that's very difficult if this is just constant in these games to establish a kind of longer term knowledge of it, it puts stress on and will make people back off if it's too difficult. The other thing is I wondered how much these technologies are paying attention to the physical changes that happen. We've talked about finding that button. It's not just an intellectual thing, but a great many older people have arthritis in their hands, particularly their thumbs. Now, is the technology focusing on using your thumbs all the time? Because that will be a problem for quite a high percentage of older people. So these are issues that I'm not sure if they're really thinking about the realities of the third age.
So I think those are all excellent points, by the way, and I appreciate the discussion. I agree with your point, and I think it's very important. I think it fits with the discussion that just went on beforehand. I agree with the point that technologies are becoming more and more embedded in our lives. I think there's no question about that. And I think that can be a very good thing, that you can incorporate it into activities programming for seniors. If I can just step back, though, and express maybe what's a word of caution about this, is that we're not just talking about, in this case at least, embedding technologies in new settings. We are talking about embedding technological commodities into new settings. This is part of consumer culture, and that consumer culture has interests that are not always aligned with those of people in general, older persons, activity participants, and that there are sort of forces working in potentially opposing directions when you introduce a commodity into any social setting. This gets us back to the point I made earlier about these messages around, say, use it or lose it. I suppose the point is that when you commodify something, you then kind of need to do a few things. I mean, one is that you need to sell it, and you need to keep selling it. So you need to kind of keep changing it over time so that you have a new product to sell over time. That's not necessarily in someone's interest who doesn't have a great grasp of technology from the get-go. Maybe they do, maybe not. And someone who just wants to use it for a very utilitarian purpose and then kind of get on with their lives. The second thing is that we tend to see that when you commodify something, you sort of make it spectacular, right? You need to have these sort of spectacular messages around the body or around the brain in order to make it seem worthwhile. And I think that's why we see the language, for example, of use it or lose it. All that to say, there are other issues too. I mean, of course, there's when you commodify something, there are relations of production that I haven't talked about at all here today. But the point I'd make in this context, I guess, is just that while I think it's kind of inexorable, this trend towards incorporating technologies into our lives, there is a need for caution and just not embracing that wholeheartedly. That is, I suppose, the message that I'm trying to get across today.
I think you actually alluded to a point, and you alluded to it in your talk about the practicality of it, though, is that you said a lot of your participants are looking at getting a connect, and that's what I found too, is that having technology constantly change, we don't live in a healthcare system that has abundant resources. So, you know, one health facility buys a Wii Fit, and that's what they get for the next, you know, they don't get anything for 6 years, but the technology has changed umpteen times in between there. So I think that's a huge barrier that they did allude to, and your participants did.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I guess that takes us back to the second part of the presentation today. So yeah, some of the or one of the homes was talking about getting a connect. You know, going back to Maureen's point about the social experience of bringing people together in a community environment, I think that's really interesting. From that point of view, you could almost view this, probably not, but almost, as like a form of resistance to the way that these technologies are imagined in marketing, right? The marketing image is of the individual consumer, maybe the family, but the individual consumer buying these technologies, using them in the home, and then presumably updating as time goes on and on and on. That's the way you kind of maximize profit, right? As many people buy it as possible. This is actually a community use. You're just buying one for a whole group of people, putting it in one room, and having people come to that room to use it together. To maybe just put a kind of some theoretical language on it, Stephen Miles, who writes about consumer culture, talks about the proliferation of spaces of consumption, he calls it. That in current times, in kind of neoliberal times, that life has become organized around moving between different spaces of consumption. You know, of course, the mall would be one, but we move to all kinds of other places where the idea is that you're supposed to engage in these market transactions. And I think with these technologies, what we're kind of seeing are these spaces of almost quasi-consumption, that these retirement homes are creating activities that are based around a commodity, and in that sense, they're sort of devoted to consumer culture in a way, and yet they move away from some of the presumed uses of these technologies at the same time. It's not one for everyone, one for one. It's one for a whole group of people. And it's not this competitive use of the game that we see in some of the marketing, although certainly the marketing portrays it as fun. They're using it in all kinds of different ways. There's sort of a creative consumption going on, and that maybe they pass around the remote between a whole bunch of people. Maybe they cheer for the opposing team, and that sort of thing. So yes, I've now moved so far away, I've forgotten what your original question was.
What is more the economic impact and barrier
Right.
for having constantly changing technologies for healthcare systems and areas that don't really have a lot of money to go around buying extra technologies all the time?
Right. Absolutely, yes. I think that's right. I think it is a strain, even though it seems like it's a one-time cost. It can be a strain as well, you know. It's
Well,
not
especially when you have to couple it with the fact that, in general, a staff person has to be there to help out, learn the technology, so it's not that you're using the technology to replace a staff person. You have actually double the cost, staff plus technology.
Right.
So.
Right, yeah.
So are you postmodernists?
That's not a fair question.
Well, you're quoting a lot of
an hour of 20 minutes.
That's okay, you don't have to answer it, you can tell me later.
Yeah, sure, we'll have a coffee sometime and chat about that.
Well, Susan,
No
Where's
other
our
questions here?
where's our mug? Our mug.
Oh. I'll get it when we're done.
Oh, are we done? I think we're done. Any more questions? Okay, that
very
was
much.
great, thank you. Fall on my face. I want to know about safety.